All right, ladies and gentlemen, I believe that we are live. So, good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all the Christians, the Jews, the Muslims, the atheists, the agnostics, the Hindus, the Buddhists, and yes, even the Scientologists who are watching all around the world right now. Tom Cruise, we love you. I am David Wood, your friendly neighborhood philosopher, and with me is the great one himself, Robert Spencer. We are going to be discussing some birthday presents from the New York Times. Robert, why don't you give everyone a little background on the New York Times and their love affair with the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, while I and everyone else who's tuned in send a message out to all our friends on Facebook and Twitter that we are live.
Yeah, the New York Times has published two, not just one, but two articles of essentially Islamic apologetics over the last 2 days. And the first one was called Happy Birthday, Muhammad, claiming that November 20th was Muhammad's birthday, which is highly disputed in the first place. But
just so everyone knows, I mean, one, people like you dispute everything about Muhammad, but even then, even among people who take the overall life pretty seriously, even the year is disputed, let alone the actual day.
Yeah, and most of the time it's in April, but Haroon Moghul says it's November 20th, and so Haroon Moghul must know because he is presented as an expert on Islam by none other than the New York Times. Haroon Moghul is a longtime Islamic apologist. He appears to be a failed academic. I say that because I have been dealing with him for many years. If you look at the archives or look up his name at my website, jihadwatch.org, you will find numerous point-by-point refutations of his tissues of lies and deceptions that he has published in the past. And for many years, he was listed as a PhD student at Columbia University, but now he is neither listed as doctor nor as a PhD student anymore. So I rather think that it's likely that Columbia is more onto him than the New York Times. But he continues to bamboozle people with lies about Islam. Obviously, he knows that when he says Muhammad was a paragon of compassion, that this isn't true. He is as you said before we went on, he's either a liar or abysmally stupid. In either case, he shouldn't be writing for the New York Times. And we'll get into the detail on that, I'm sure. The other article is by another Islamic apologist who you can say the same things about, Mustafa Akyol, who is a Turkish writer who for many years has been an exponent of moderate Islam. He was moderate Islam before moderate Islam was cool. He was before Zuhdi Jasser and all the current famous moderate Muslims. He was writing articles of this kind, and he wrote a piece saying that there is in true Islam no blasphemy law, no death penalty for blasphemy, which I know will come as news to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Somalia, Pakistan, Sudan, Afghanistan, and all the others that assume and have thousands of Muslim clerics in them, if not millions, who are absolutely certain, based on their own studies of the Quran and Sunnah, that there is a death penalty for blasphemy. But they've all gotten it wrong, and all the great Islamic entities, all the caliphates and so on, all got it wrong for 14 centuries. But here's Mustafa Akyol now in the New York Times to set it all right.
And this is something we see over and over again, what you just pointed out, right? That there have been Muslims for 14 centuries, since the time of Muhammad and the time of the rightly guided caliphs who spread across Arabia and then out of Arabia, spread across northern Africa up into Europe and spread eastward into India and China even, and did all of this somehow by defense. But we hear from Muslims in America and Canada and the UK who claim that they understand Islam better than 14 centuries worth of jihadis. We hear from them that Islam is actually peaceful, tolerant. It encourages religious pluralism, no penalty whatsoever for speaking against Muhammad, anything like that. It's just one big interfaith religion. That's what we hear. All right.
Yes.
Well, what's that? Go ahead.
It's just plainly cynical and deceptive. We can also note that throughout that history that you just downgraded, the fact is that the blasphemy laws have been enforced everywhere that Islam has been in charge, has been the law. And in Spain, in tolerant, pluralistic Muslim Spain, there are numerous accounts of Christians who disputed the Islamic faith with Muslims and then were executed for blasphemy, or Christians who mocked Muhammad or Islam, perhaps not realizing that this was a death penalty offense, and ended up dead. And in my own church, the Orthodox Church, there's even a whole category of martyrs called New Martyrs of the Turkish Yoke, who were Christians in the Ottoman Empire after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, who under similar circumstances were executed for blasphemy, just for disagreeing with a Muslim about whether Muhammad was a prophet, or disputing and affirming the Christian faith in the face of Muslims who were denying it.
Now, Robert, just as a little side note here, it's not just in actual Muslim majority countries like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. Notice, ladies and gentlemen, these ethnically, geographically, these places are very, very different, and yet they come to remarkably similar conclusions about what Islam teaches when it comes to blasphemy. But isn't it true, Robert, that even outside of the Muslim world, even in places like Europe, you can be penalized for speaking against Muhammad?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, in the first place, you can be penalized for speaking against Muhammad in pretty much any Muslim country. And then now the European Commission for Human Rights has actually ruled quite recently in the case of a woman who will be familiar to many of us, Elizabeth Sabatich-Wolf. She is an activist in Austria. And she was giving a seminar several years ago and was approached privately on the sidelines during a break by somebody who was attending the seminar, who asked about Muhammad and his notorious marriage to Aisha when he was 51 and she was 6, and then consummation of the marriage when he was 54 and she was 9. And she, of course, Elizabeth Sabatich-Wolf, of course, affirmed that all this was true according to the Islamic sources, and that this would qualify Muhammad as a pedophile by any modern standard. She was tried for hate speech or whatever bogus thing the Austrian law has for silencing criticism of Islam and enforcing Islamic blasphemy laws. And she's been disputing this for years, that she was convicted, sentenced to jail time and a fine. And it just went to the ECHR, the European Commission on Human Rights, and they ruled that yes, it was wrong to criticize Muhammad. It did not fall within the category of free speech, and thus the penalty that she'd been given by the Austrian court was upheld.
And I saw recently when Geert Wilders was planning on having a Draw Muhammad contest or something like that, that I saw in mainstream media publications, Muslims who were arguing that free speech should not protect that sort of thing. And, you know, why that's amazing is, I mean, we see this in the media, right? If anyone should be defending freedom of speech, it should be the media, but the media were publishing articles from Muslim apologists saying that free speech should not protect things like criticism of Muhammad or mocking Muhammad. And this is just amazing here that this is what we have in the West, that this is being promoted in the West, kinds of blasphemy laws. And so very, very, very strange times that we are living in. All right, well, we are going to look at some of the claims in these articles. I'll go ahead and I took some screenshots from the New York Times. We'll go ahead and put those up on the screen. I did want to tell everyone before we continue, we have about 500 on already. Be sure to hit that like button that tells the YouTube algorithm that this is good stuff that other people want to see. And most of you who know Robert Spencer either know him from his books or from his talks or from his website, Jihad Watch. But he also has a YouTube page. I put the link to his YouTube page in the description box. He posts videos pretty regularly over there, so be sure to click on that and subscribe to Robert's channel. All right, well, let's go ahead and start this article. We'll go through it. We're not going to read the whole thing. It's kind of long, but you can check it out. I forgot to put the link, but I'll add the links to the articles after we're done. All right, so let's go ahead and read some of this. He was an outsider like me, Robert. So this is a Muslim writing, and he talks about having health problems when he was young and so on. Now he's talking about Muhammad. So Muhammad was an outsider like me. Being an orphan from age 6 in a very patrilineal, very patriarchal, and very tribal society must have been a social death sentence. Muhammad could have reacted by seething with resentment and lashing out at the world. He could have turned on himself. Instead, he became a paragon of compassion. I should have called this video Muhammad, the paragon of compassion. I don't know what Robert is laughing about. It's almost like he knows something that this writer just doesn't know. But let's face it, it's in the New York Times. It's official. Muhammad was a paragon of compassion. Now, when he first proclaimed prophecy, even his own uncle laughed at him like Robert is laughing right now. But he never laughed back. Muhammad never laughed back. His followers were reviled, beaten, and killed. He didn't strike back. Rather, he ran from one town to another, like Hagar at Paran, desperate to find his people refuge. 12 years into his religious mission, in the year 622, he was forced to flee his native Mecca and arrived a refugee in Medina. But the people who chased him there didn't leave him be. So they chased Muhammad there to Medina. Remember this. They chased Muhammad to Medina, and then they didn't leave him alone there. They kept coming after him. So not long after finding safe harbor, he was forced to take up arms time and again to defend his faith, his community, and himself. Well, I don't know about you, Robert, but this sounds like a good guy so far in what we're reading here from the New York Times. But I'm wondering, you've been studying Islam and the history of Muhammad for years. Do you see anything that might conflict with that? Not according to us, not according to Christian sources, not according to Jewish sources. Do you see anything from Muslim sources that might conflict with this picture that we were given of Muhammad?
Pretty much everything he said is false according to Muslim sources. Muhammad is an orphan from age 6. But he's raised by his uncles. He was never an outcast or an outsider. He was always a member of the community, a respected member of the community from a very early age, according to the Islamic sources. So Haroon Moghul has got to know that. And it wasn't as if he was some sort of street urchin or something. And he becomes a prophet. He immediately begins to antagonize the people of Mecca by telling them that they're going to hell, by cursing one of his uncles to hellfire for getting irritated with him for calling out the whole community to hear his message. And when he moved to Medina...
One second right there, Robert. I wanted to jump in and read a little section from the history of Tabari to show what you're saying. Right? So the way it's presented in the articles we read is that Muhammad's just this nice, peaceful prophet. Everyone hates him because of that and eventually run him out. Not exactly what we read in Muslim sources. In fact, according to Muslim sources, his people had absolutely no problem with him being a Muslim or with preaching Islam. What they objected to was, as Robert pointed out, he started antagonizing them, mocking and insulting their gods and their lineage, their genealogies. So let me go ahead and read 2 passages here from the History of At-Tabari. This is volume 6. You can look it up. History of At-Tabari, volume 6, page 93. The messenger of Allah, that's Muhammad, proclaimed Allah's message openly and declared Islam publicly to his fellow tribesmen. When he did so, they did not withdraw from him or reject him in any way. They had no problem with it. Until when? Until he spoke of their gods and denounced them. That's when they had a problem with it. Now, let me go ahead and give you a little passage a little later when the pagans who are complaining about Muhammad, trying to get his uncle Abu Talib to step in and stop Muhammad from making fun of their gods, from ridiculing their gods, this is the charge they bring before him. They say, History of At-Tabari, Volume 6, page 101, "We have never seen the like of what we have endured from this man. He has derided our traditional values, abused our forefathers, reviled our religion, caused division among us, and insulted our gods. We have endured a great deal from him." So they endured this, and Robert, they endured this for a long time, right? I mean, think about it. Yeah. So, for the first little bit after he becomes a prophet, so 610, he sort of preaches in private. He tries to win other people in private, but eventually he starts preaching Islam openly. And so he preaches Islam openly for about 10 years, making fun of the gods of the people of Mecca. Again, 10 years. Now, yes, there were persecutions. We read about this in the Muslim sources, but he survived. He walked out of Mecca after 10 years of criticizing the beliefs of the people of Mecca. And Muslim writers point to this and say, look at how intolerant these people were. Now, Robert, if we'd like a little comparison here, Muhammad made it 10 years criticizing the religious beliefs of the people of Mecca in the 7th century Arabia. Do you think you or I would last 10 years if we went and openly criticized the religious beliefs of the people of Mecca in Mecca today? Would we last 10 years?
We wouldn't last 10 minutes.
I don't think we'd last 10 minutes either if we were doing what Muhammad did, namely standing outside of the Kaaba, making fun of the beliefs of the religious beliefs of the people who live there. So yes, again, there were persecutions and things like that, but compared to Muhammad and his companions and the people that descended from them, these were the most tolerant people on the planet compared to Muhammad. Yes. Right? So let's be clear. And then so he goes through this for a while, and then he doesn't promise, hey, I'm leaving and everything's going to be fine. He promises, this is according to the Muslim sources, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Robert, but I think Muhammad promised to bring them slaughter, did he not?
That is his exact words. I bring you slaughter. He said this to the Quraysh, and what happened was when he left Mecca and went to Medina, contrary to what Haroon Moghul says, they did not pursue him there. But the first thing that happened was he didn't when he got the Muslim community to Medina, he didn't say, okay, now open up shops and make a living or start farms. He said, go out and raid the caravans of the Meccans. And so he
Whoa. Hey, now this is important what you're saying right here, because what you just said totally contradicts what we're about to read in this article. So we've covered Mecca. So we got the period of Mecca, and what we hear from the New York Times and their crack squad of journalists on Islam is that Muhammad never reacted with hostility towards people's beliefs about him and so on. And we read the Muslim sources, completely different story. But now we're getting into Medina, and let's compare what you're about to say, because you're talking about him robbing the caravans. Let's see what we have here. Matter of fact, let's go back there. Did he mention it there?
Yeah, he mentioned it.
Okay, you're right. Yeah, so let's take it from there. So let me remind everyone. Not long after finding safe harbor, so this is when he went to Medina. This is the very end of this screenshot here. He was forced to take up arms time and again to defend his faith, his community, and himself. And notice what it says right before that. The people who chased him there didn't leave him be. So, Robert, according to the New York Times, Muhammad went there. He was just minding his own business, but the people who chased him there wouldn't leave him alone. They're harassing and attacking him until the point where he has absolutely no choice but to defend his own community and his own property. Now, you've already mentioned a little bit, but go ahead and comment on that.
Well, when Haroon Moghul says that they wouldn't leave him alone, but they went to Medina, I think he's probably thinking about the Battle of Badr, when the Meccans really did march out of Mecca and approach the Muslims in Medina. But this was by no means the beginning of the hostilities. The raiding of the caravans was before that. And the Muslims were actually directed to make their living by raiding the caravans of the Quraysh, the Meccan pagan Arabs that Muhammad had left, and to rob them and kill them. And
Robert, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but after Muhammad launched attack after attack on their caravans without them retaliating, they finally simply sent an army to protect their own caravan that they knew Muhammad would attack. Because he kept attacking that, not only did he keep attacking it, he even his followers even went out and killed someone during the holy month in a caravan raid. And so even when we have the Battle of Badr, that was just the Meccans trying to protect their own property from someone who's attacking and harassing them. Is that correct?
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And I'm sorry, I just lost the train of thought. You just talking about Badr, and that Badr was just to protect the caravans, but there was something else in there that you'd said. I'm sorry. Anyway, I'm getting old, David. The main thing, though, is that the sacred month. That was what I wanted to pick up on. That there was even an agreement among the Arabs of the time that they would not fight during 4 designated months in the calendar that they all shared. And one of the most notorious caravan raids came when Muhammad sent out some of his men to raid the caravan of the Quraysh, the pagan Meccan Arabs, and they found it, they only tracked it during the sacred month. And they knew that one of the sacred months, and they knew that if it got back if they let it go and let the sacred month pass, they would get back to Mecca safely. The caravan would get back to Mecca safely. So they had a choice. They could either go back to Medina, having failed in the mission that Muhammad had sent them out on, or they could violate the sacred month and rob the caravan and kill the Meccans during the sacred month.
So obviously they're just gonna give up their chance to steal some property, to rob some property, because they don't want to violate a general truce. That would be wrong and immoral according to Islam. And certainly Allah and Muhammad would never approve of that sort of thing. So you go ahead and tell me how I'm right in what I just said.
Well, I guess if Haroon Moghul had been there, he would have said, "Oh, heavens to Betsy, we can't raid the caravan." But the Muslims who were there, they said, well, of course, we're going to raid the caravan. And they came back to Medina with all the goods that they had stolen from the caravan and whatever they had been able to plunder from the people that they killed. And Muhammad, to their shock and horror, was not happy and would not receive them. And he said, "I did not tell you to fight during the sacred month." But then, as so often happens in the Islamic literature, he got a revelation from Allah, saying it's twice in the Quran, in chapter 2, verse 191, and chapter 2, verse 217, saying persecution is worse than slaughter. And 217 is very explicit about it. They ask you about fighting during the sacred month. Fighting during that time is an awesome evil, but persecution is worse than slaughter, which means that the Quraysh, the Muslims of Mecca, the Arabs of Mecca, the non-Muslims of Mecca, were persecuting you, and so therefore it's permissible for you to slaughter them even during the sacred month. And so the upshot is you can violate a moral norm in the service of your expediency if it furthers the cause of Islam. So this is a manifesto for unrestricted violence and theft, and Haroon Moghul is saying that it's all just defensive warfare. It's astonishing because he must have read the same sources. There's not some multiplicity of sources or disagreement about these issues in the early Muslim sources. He must know what they say, and he is actively misleading his New York Times readers about what they say.
And we've pointed this out before. Whenever someone is saying the kinds of things that we're reading in the New York Times right now, there are only two possibilities, right? There are, of course, certain things within Islam that are open to interpretation that can be debated. If your claim is actually that it was the Meccans who were harassing and attacking Muhammad and wouldn't leave him alone when he went to Medina, and they're out there attacking him and his community, and he only raises up arms in defense of his own people. If you're claiming that, when the actual Muslim sources across the board agree that Once Muhammad left, he started attacking them. He attacked their caravans over and over and over again until they actually violated a general truce, killing someone during a holy month when they weren't allowed to kill, received a revelation from God justifying the killing. That's when the people of Mecca said, we need to send an army with our stuff because this guy will not hesitate to kill and slaughter to get it. And then the Muslims come out when there's an army there. That's when you have the Battle of Badr. If you look at all of that in the Muslim sources and you actually tell people Muhammad was just minding his own business, it's the Meccans who came after him. There are only two possibilities. One, you are completely ignorant. You have no clue what you're talking about. Or two, you do know what you're talking about and you're a liar. Those are the only two possibilities. But guess what? Whatever the case may be, whichever one of those options is true, you should not be writing articles for the New York Times, and the New York Times should not be publishing your either outright deceptive or completely moronic claims. Would you agree, Robert?
I couldn't agree more. And I got to wonder, Haroon Moghul has written a great deal about Islamophobia and the supposed persecution and harassment and discrimination that Muslims in America face. He even wrote of, I got a lot of fun out of this. He even wrote that his Starbucks name was Dwayne because he's so afraid to go into Starbucks and say his name is Haroon and be faced with Islamophobic baristas.
Yeah, all those Muslims who've been killed in Starbucks. It's a massive atrocity. We sit here and we hear about all the, the Christians being persecuted in Pakistan and so on. But I mean, come on. I mean, they have no right to complain. They haven't been through anything that Muslims in Starbucks have been through.
Yeah. So I had fun with that. I went into a Starbucks and said my name was Haroon and waited for the onslaught and nothing happened. I just got a cup of coffee.
They didn't beat you up?
No, it was really weird. Maybe they just knew that it wasn't really my name. I don't know.
No one confuses me more than you do, Robert. I hear one thing and then you totally contradict everything I hear, so I don't know what to believe anymore. All right, let's read a little bit more from the New York Times. But even as he did, he remained dedicated to building a society that would provide the inclusion he and his followers had been deprived of. The old Muslims from Mecca had just met the new Muslims from Medina, and Muhammad paired them off, each responsible for the other, as they worked to make Medina flourish. That's what they were working for. This was hard work and represents the most misunderstood part of Muhammad's life. Taking Jesus as their example, many critics wonder how a leader who pursues politics can still be a religious model. So that's one. I wanted to continue that passage right there, so I'll put this up on the screen. When terrorists struck New York and Washington in 2001, I was horrified, scared, and bewildered. The Muhammad I revered bore no resemblance to the Muhammad they claimed. In their view, Muhammad was a conqueror first, a politician and a general second, and a man of faith last and least, as if these things are in conflict, according to Islam. This is a gross misunderstanding of his life and an inversion of the message he actually preached when he had nowhere else to turn, when he couldn't find anyone to protect his community. Then, and only then, did he take up arms to defend his faith. So, Robert, the Muhammad that actually lived and breathed and walked in Arabia peacefully, calmly, he's completely at odds with Muslims who would terrorize the unbelievers, who would strike terror into the hearts of unbelievers. Do you agree, and are you ready to finally change your views now that you've been informed from the New York Times that Muhammad was peaceful and only resorted to violence when he had absolutely no other choice?
Strike terror into the hearts of the unbelievers is, of course, from the Quran itself. And so you got to wonder why this peaceful fellow kept getting revelations, because you've got chapter 8, verse 60, strike terror in the hearts of the enemies of Allah. You've got chapter 8, verse 12, strike terror. Once again, 3:151, I will strike terror in the hearts of the unbelievers. 3 times this is affirmed. And so you got to wonder, why does he keep getting revelations like this if he's such a sweet, peaceful fellow? And why does he himself say, I have been commanded to fight against people until they confess that there's no God but Allah and I am his messenger. Why does he tell his followers in another hadith to invite the unbelievers to accept Islam? And if they refuse, then to invite them to pay the jizya, which is the tax that the non-Muslims have to pay as a sign of their submission to the Muslims. And if they refuse both, to go to war with them. You also have to wonder if Haroon Moghul really thinks that his readers are going to think that 9/11 was the first act of Islamic terror. Does he really think that that Al-Qaeda invented that, and that Al-Qaeda invented their understanding of Islam? Obviously, throughout Islamic history, there's been terror. There have been acts of violence committed in the name of Islam and in accord with its teachings at every place and in every time that every place Muslims have gone, and every time since there's been Islam. And the thing then that Haroon Moghul is asking us to believe is that all these Muslims, right from the beginning, have misunderstood Islam. And, in our last, whatever you call these things, in our last video, we discussed all these various stages of Islamic history, the rightly guided caliphates, and then the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Ottoman Caliphate, and so on, and all the others, and all the violence that they perpetrated. And you've got to think, Haroon Moghul would have us believe that every one of these people whose lives were dedicated to Islam did not actually understand it correctly. And that now Haroon is along, finally, and the New York Times, to set Muslims straight as well as non-Muslims. And I expect now that this article has been published that ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram and Abu Sayyaf and all the rest of them all around the world will be laying down their arms and taking non-Muslims to tea, because that's the correct way that Muhammad would have behaved.
Well, I mean, as we all know, Muslim groups like Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they get their information from the New York Times. I mean, that's where they go to. All true Muslims, as we know, go to the New York Times and to other Western publications to learn about Islam. They don't go to the actual Muslim sources, because if they did, they would read something like this, right? They would read Surah 5, verse 33 of the Quran, "The punishment of those who wage war against Allah and his apostle and strive to make mischief in the land is only this, that they should be murdered or crucified, or their hands and their feet should be cut off on opposite sides, or they should be imprisoned. This shall be as a disgrace for them in this world, and in the hereafter they shall have a grievous chastisement." Now notice, this refers to making war against Allah. How do you do that? Well, it says, by making mischief in the land, right? So you're making mischief in the land. How do you do that? Well, Robert, we see this. Don't we see over and over again that nations are arresting and sentencing people to death for the vague crime of making mischief in the land?
The Islamic Republic of Iran just did it last week. A currency trader. I would expect that his crime was misusing the funds in some way, or perhaps just collecting interest, which is against Islam. But in any case, the Islamic Republic of Iran sentenced him according to exactly this crime, sentenced him for this crime, making mischief, in the land, and he was executed.
And so this vague crime, making mischief in the land, right, gives different penalties. You should be killed or crucified or have body parts chopped off, so dismembered. There can be a variety of crimes, a variety of penalties, depending on the severity of the mischief that you're making. Now, as far as I can tell, the most severe form of mischief you can make in a Muslim land would be bringing a foreign military of unbelievers into the land to make mischief in the land.
That would do it.
That would sound correct, right?
Osama bin Laden said. Osama bin Laden, of course, in his explanations for why he perpetrated the 9/11 attacks, explained that it was because the U.S. Army went to decamped in Saudi Arabia to fight against Saddam Hussein in the first Gulf War in the 90s. Now, this was something that you would have thought they would be happy about, because Saddam Hussein was a tyrant and had annexed Kuwait and so on. From the point of view of what we understood at the time, or what the American government was saying at the time, at least. But Osama bin Laden was absolutely enraged that the non-Muslim troops of the United States were in Saudi Arabia, because that is the kingdom of the two holy places. And Muhammad on his deathbed said, I will expel all the Jews and Christians from the Arabian Peninsula. And so he thought that their being there was a great insult, an affront to Islam, and he thought that it warranted a massive attack on the United States as a defensive jihad measure to prevent this sort of thing from happening again.
And here's why I find this interesting, right? Because after the 9/11 attacks, several years actually, when I started debating, and this would be brought up, that Islam doesn't allow the killing of innocents like you have in the 9/11 attacks and so on. And I actually said, well, if you look at what the Muslim sources actually say, the penalty for making mischief in a Muslim land, in the way that Muslims would regard the United States as making mischief in the land, is death, right? Death. So the American leaders and their military presence, the soldiers, these guys would all be under a death sentence. But according to Muhammad himself, in sources like Sahih al-Bukhari and other hadiths, the person who funds, who pays the bills for a soldier to make mischief in a Muslim land gets an equal reward, right?
That's every American taxpayer.
Yeah. So that, and by the way, that makes perfect sense, right? The Muslim soldier who goes out and wages jihad, he can't do that without someone buying his equipment and things like that. So that person is also responsible for the attack. That's what Muhammad is saying. But also the reverse, where if you are the American military making mischief in a Muslim land, you didn't get there by magic. You are funded by the American taxpayer. So is the American taxpayer who's working in the World Trade Center innocent because he hasn't gone and done anything out there himself? Absolutely not. This person funded them. So I saw that in the Muslim sources, and I responded. And that's when someone said, Osama bin Laden said the exact same thing to justify it. So why would Osama bin Laden say the exact same thing I say? Well, it's because we're both reading the exact same Muslim sources.
There you go.
And who's not? The New York Times apparently is not. All right, go ahead.
The New York Times certainly is not. That much we can be sure of. I'm not sure that Haroon Moghul is not, but certainly nobody in the New York Times thought, hey, let's go back and read Bukhari and see if what Haroon Moghul is saying about 9/11 and how it would be against everything Muhammad stood for is true. If they had, of course, they would have known. If they'd read the slightest bit of material about Muhammad's life from the earliest Muslim sources, then they would never have published this garbage.
And yet they do, over and over again, like a beating drum. Well, I haven't had enough, so let's read a little bit more here. But the politics he attempted are instructive. In one of his first pronouncements in Medina, he pledged that the Muslim community would defend the native Jewish community from any of its enemies, and declared Medina to be one nation of two faiths, a profound and unusual gesture of pluralism and tolerance. So, Robert, Muhammad did form alliances and so on early on here. So, isn't this evidence that Islam actually seeks peace with the unbelievers?
He formed alliances. There were 3 Jewish tribes in Medina, the Kainuka, Qurayza, and Nadir, and he formed alliances with them. And this is absolutely true, but it is unfortunately not the end of the story. He very quickly on confronted the Nadir and the Kainuka, demanded that they convert to Islam. They refused, and he exiled them from Medina. He left the Qurayza there, but they had every reason to think that the same thing was going to happen to them. Before it could happen, however, the Meccans came again. And this was not a gratuitous attack on the part of the Meccans, but they had been attacked many times by Muhammad, and they were once again trying to put an end to the threat that he posed to them. So they came to Medina, to besiege it. And Muhammad ordered the digging of a trench around the city, which in those days was an effective enough tactic to stymie the siege. Although the siege did go on for quite a while, and made the Medinans, tell you it's a bad day, David. But in any case,
What?
the Medinans
I know
were
you're the busiest man out there, so go ahead.
they were in the city, very uncomfortable. Their supplies were running out, and things were very tense. But the Meccans couldn't get close enough to Medina to break into the city itself because of the trench. Now, meanwhile, the inside the city with the Muslims are the Qurayza Jews. And they knew what had happened to the Kainuka and the Nadir, so they sent word out to the Meccans that they would help them. After the siege was broken and the Meccans returned home without having entered Medina and without having defeated the Muslims, then Muhammad got wind of the fact that the Qurayza had betrayed him. And he asked one of his lieutenants, Sa'd ibn al-Mu'ad, to pronounce sentence. And Sa'd said, you should execute all the men and exile all the women and children. And Muhammad rejoiced at this at this sentence, said that it was right. It was the word from Allah. And so he had all the men of the Qurayza line up by the trench and personally beheaded between 600 and 900 of them. This is presented in the Islamic apologetics as a wartime measure and mere retaliation for their betrayal. But here again, their betrayal is not the beginning of the story. They didn't gratuitously betray him because he was such a sweet guy and they were black-hearted. They sent word to the Meccans because they had seen that Muhammad had betrayed the two other Jewish tribes previously. And so they had every reason to think that he is eventually going to turn upon us and kill and or exile us. And so we are trying to take measures to protect ourselves. Ultimately, they did suffer the same fate. And then, of course, Muhammad traveled to the oasis of Khaybar, where the Kainuka and Nadir and the remaining people of the Qurayza were there, and he massacred them. And that, of course, gave rise to the genocidal chant that Islamic jihadis still chant, and that we often hear even Muslim protesters. I heard Muslim protesters in New York City chanting it. I was right there. And it's Khaybar, Khaybar, O Jews, the army of Muhammad will return. In other words, he's massacred you now several times, and he's going to finish the job.
Robert, I wanted to look at one comment here because there are lots of these over here. But the Muslims here in the comment section are trying as hard as they can to prove you wrong. So we see here, put the comment up on the screen. Islam is going to dominate the world and will enter every house, although devils like wood don't like it.
They're such peaceful, gentle followers of their magnanimous prophet.
Yes, thank you for proving everything we're saying about the true spirit of Islam and the true teachings of Muhammad. Thank you for proving everything we're saying wrong and proving the New York Times right, that Islam is peaceful and has no designs on taking over the world. Robert, I did want to read one hadith. You mentioned it earlier. I actually want to put this on the screen. But the Jews who remained were absolutely correct, right? When they realized, hey, Muhammad formed an initial alliance with us, but his ultimate goal is to subjugate or expel us. Yeah. Yes. And so you mentioned this hadith. This is from Sahih Muslim. So if you're denying this, doesn't get much better in the Muslim sources than Sahih Muslim. Number 4594. Jabir bin Abdullah said, Umar bin al-Khattab said that he heard the Messenger of Allah say, I shall certainly expel the Jews and Christians from the Arabian Peninsula until I leave only Muslims there. Now notice, he doesn't say, I'm going to expel particular Jews and Christians who start a war with me or something like that. I'm going to expel Jews and Christians until only Muslims are left. In other words, every last Jew, every last Christian, every last pagan. Notice he says expel the Jews and Christians because the pagans would just be killed. The pagans would just be killed. The Jews and Christians had to be expelled if they weren't doing anything worthy of death, or the jizya hadn't been established yet. They had to get out of there as quickly as possible. But notice, no more Jews, no more Christians, only Muslims. So the Jews of Medina, especially after they'd seen what happened to the first two tribes, they were absolutely correct. They were on to Muhammad, right? Muhammad is making alliances in public, but behind the scenes, he's plotting. He's plotting to subjugate or expel or kill everyone in the Arabian Peninsula. So they were absolutely correct. What was their crime? Oh, they tried to form an alliance. They tried to form an alliance to defend themselves so it wouldn't happen to them. Didn't work. They were slaughtered. And that's just history. So if you're saying otherwise, well, you might be writing for the New York Times.
Another thing, too, David, that's a deathbed statement that Muhammad makes. Mm-hmm. I will expel all the Jews and Christians. So this is after he has decimated the Jewish community of Arabia. He has destroyed two and a half of the tribes, essentially. And there are some remnants of the Jews that had been there before the advent of Islam, but it's a small group of people with no political power, no military power, nothing. And the Christians never had political or military power in Arabia. So you've got him saying this. It's a gratuitously offensive statement. I don't mean offensive in the sense that I'm offended. I mean that it's offensive warfare. Mm-hmm. He's not expelling them for any reason in the sense that they pose any kind of threat.
Yep, they're not Muslims. That's their crime. They're not Muslims.
There you go. And so it's totally opposite to what our friend Haroon Moghul would have us believe.
All right. One quick comment here, just so you don't get the wrong idea about the Muslim who said that Islam was going to dominate and be in every house. Someone added a comment here, and I'm only putting this because this is funny. It says he's just misunderstood. Right? So the Muslim who said that is just misunderstood. So he could feel better now, Robert.
I love that.
We're misunderstanders of Islam, and we're misunderstanders of the comments. These guys are pretty funny over in the comment section here. All right, let's go ahead and read another passage or two. This again from the New York Times. The vision that Muhammad offered for Medina is the one that drives my life's work.
Oh, I'll bet it does, Haroon.
Yeah, well, we've seen that was the subjugation, the outright subjugation of the entire population, and a perfectly uniform Muslim population. That's what the Muslim sources say. Especially in the years since September 11th. I've dedicated my time, my energy, and often my reputation to building bridges between Jewish and Muslim communities. Wow. Muhammad certainly built plenty of bridges. They were made out of heads. They were made out of severed heads, but he made some bridges, yeah.
This bridge building is a constant phrase. Mm-hmm. We always hear about this from CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, from every other Islamic organization in the United States, from every Muslim individual or group that engages in dialogue with Jews and Christians. They always cast it in this language. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's very interesting because I've read Sayyid Qutb, Milestones, and Fizil al-Quran, his In the Shade of the Quran, his multi-volume commentary on the Quran. And in these things, Sayyid Qutb, of course, was the great theorist of the Muslim Brotherhood of the mid-20th century. And he says we should always be careful to build bridges with the Jews and Christians. But we have to understand it's a one-way bridge. Mm-hmm. We are reaching out to them to bring them to Islam. It's not as if there's some sort of an actual intellectual give and take here. And, I don't, maybe Haroon Moghul has never read Sayyid Qutb or vehemently disagrees with him. But I find it interesting that this is the same phrase, the same term that's always used by these guys, these patently dishonest, disingenuous, cynical individuals. And they're always telling us that they're working at building bridges. I can't help but think that this is just an admission to those in the know, to the Muslims who will be reading the New York Times article, that this is all dawah to render Americans ignorant and complacent about Muhammad and the jihad threat, and to soften them up for what's coming next.
All right, that's one theory. Another theory is that everything he's saying is correct. So let's go ahead and see what he finishes here with. So he says he's dedicated his time, my energy, and often my reputation to building bridges between Jewish and Muslim communities. We don't have to agree about everything to respect each other. And we don't have to see eye to eye to look out for each other. I believe such work to be a sacred calling, good for Jews and for Muslims, but good for America too. On the occasion of his birthday, we Americans would do well to study Muhammad's life. He preached and attempted a politics of tolerance, which is not what people of faith are associated with today. Muslims could stand for a re-examining of his life too. So, Robert, we have here building bridges between Jewish and Muslim communities and a politics of tolerance. So is that what we find in the Muslim story? Just as a little side note, right? He says we should respect each other even if we disagree. Is it true that I've heard somewhere that chapter 98, verse 6 of the Quran calls Jews and Christians who reject Muhammad the worst of creatures, lower than dogs, lower than pigs? Is that correct, or have I heard that wrong?
That's what it says. I prefer the translation that says the most vile of created beings.
So we are the most vile of created beings, lower than dogs, lower than pigs. And this Quran is what he's building his bridges upon, right? His bridges of his tolerant community. As far as the tolerance goes, because for some reason he's really emphasizing the bridges between Jews and Muslims. Now, according to Muslim sources, not according to the New York Times, according to Muslim sources, we've talked about what happened to the Jews in Arabia and that Muhammad wanted them expelled and that he slaughtered a bunch of them. He waged war against Jewish tribes in Arabia. But what's the goal as far as the Jews are concerned? What's the Islamic goal when it comes to the Jews?
Well, of course, there's the famous hadith where Muhammad says, the end times will not come. The last day will not come until Muslims kill Jews. And the Jews will hide behind trees, and the trees will call out, "O Muslim, there is a Jew hiding behind me. Come and kill him." So it's a charming vision, really.
Yeah, whatever these writers for the New York Times believe in, according to actual Islam, any sort of alliances or bridge building with the Jews would only be temporary, in order to lull them in a kind of sleep until they are eventually violently subjugated and slaughtered. Would that be
Precisely.
correct? Yeah.
Yes, because you have this, it's a patently genocidal hadith. It says the last day will not come until Muslims kill Jews, which seems to me that, correct me if I'm wrong, David, that seems to be a mandate that you better go out and kill Jews because you want the last day to come. You want the consummation of all things to be brought about.
Yeah, you want your virgins, right?
You can hasten it by killing Jews, so you better get on with it. And so this is one of the most monstrous, one of the most evil statements that's ever been made. It's a clear incitement to mass murder and genocide.
Well, that depends on who we believe. I mean, we can either believe Muhammad or we can believe the New York Times. We can either believe Allah or we can believe the New York Times. Obviously, the New York Times believes that we should believe the New York Times, not Allah and Muhammad. And if we're lucky, again, jihadis will keep getting their information from the New York Times. Their hearts will melt and they'll embrace all of us in a gesture of love and brotherhood. All right, let's go ahead and look. We only have a few minutes left, but we have two more. Basically, we'll just look at the title and read one passage. So this is from the other article that you mentioned.
Yes.
True Islam does not kill blasphemers. And the little heading there, the Quran has 6,236 verses, none of which tell the faithful to stifle blasphemy by force. And of course, the implication here is that only the Quran speaks for Islam. Well, even if view of Islam, notice if that's his actual position, he would be considered a heretic in Islam. Yes. for maintaining that. Let me read one passage, and then we'll get your response, Robert. He writes, Muslims who support such violent or oppressive responses to blasphemy. So he's referring to the Asia Bibi case where she was convicted of blasphemy, sentenced to death, overturned, but now she's trapped there because the violent mobs threatened the government into keeping her and reviewing her case. But he writes, Muslims who support such violent or oppressive responses to blasphemy are missing two important points. One is that it is them, not the blasphemers, who are defaming Islam by presenting it as an immature tradition that has little room for civilized discourse. Notice, he says that if Islam actually calls for killing blasphemers and for not allowing criticism, it's an immature tradition. His words, not mine. The second point is that their zealotry is not as religiously grounded as they think. To see this, one must look at the Quran, the most fundamental and only undisputed source of Islam. Most notably, throughout all of its 6,236 verses, it never tells Muslims to silence blasphemy with force. It tells them only to respond with dignity. So, Islam isn't immature, as you'd think, of a religion that calls for, the death sentence for blasphemy. Instead, it only calls for dignity through the Quran. What do you think of that, Robert?
But look, David, even if you take the Quran, you quoted 533 earlier about the penalties for those who make mischief in the land, being killed or crucified, or your hands and feet cut off on opposite sides. Now, many Islamic scholars would say that making mischief in the land would include blasphemy. Certainly. Also, you've got 3357. Those who annoy Allah and His Messenger, Allah has cursed them in this world and in the hereafter and has prepared for them a humiliating punishment. If Allah has cursed them in this world and the hereafter and He's prepared for them the punishment, then it would be reasonable to surmise that the punishment could be applied in this world, and this is the death penalty for the blasphemer. I mean, also, you've got to wonder, Akyol sweeps aside the hadith and acts as if it's not authentic. But where did it come from? It was written by people who were reading the Quran and perhaps also writing the Quran, and they did not understand the death penalty. Every school of Islamic law, every school of Islamic jurisprudence, every sect, they have the death penalty for blasphemy. So we have to understand here again, as with Moghul, that they all misunderstood the texts. And they all got it all wrong. And so it just strains credulity beyond the breaking point.
Absolutely. And so if we go with the Quran, though, because he wants to just go to the Quran, and there's a reason he only wants to go to the Quran, right? The reason he only wants to go to the Quran is lots of these passages are ambiguous and could be interpreted either way. So a person who wants to execute Asia Bibi could point to these passages that you've brought up very easily and say, she's obviously making mischief in the land if she's making fun of Muhammad or drinking out of a Muslim's cup or something like that. So it'd certainly fit into there. But, Muslims in the West could say, but that's not really what that means. The problem, of course, is that in the Quran, which the New York Times is telling us to go to, you also have chapter 4, verse 65. But no, by your Lord, they can have no faith until they make you, Muhammad, judge in all disputes between them and find in themselves no resistance against your decisions and accept them with full submission. So the Quran here is telling Muslims that they don't just have to obey the word of Allah, which is the Quran, they also have to obey Muhammad and find absolutely no resistance in themselves against Muhammad's decisions. Why is this important? Well, let me bring up one passage here. This is from Ibn Ishaq. So when Muhammad conquered Mecca, when the Muslims conquered Mecca, Muhammad told his followers to not kill the people who weren't resisting, except specific individuals that he ordered them to kill no matter where they're found. Now, one of them was someone who had killed someone and apostatized, but look in the box section here. He also, this man who had killed someone and apostatized, so this guy had to die. He had two singing girls, Fartana and her friend, who used to sing satirical songs about the apostle, so he ordered that they should be killed with him. They had to be killed. Why? For singing songs making fun of him. All right? We have, in the rest of the section here, you can skim through it because we're about out of time. You can read down, and Sarah, at the end there, Sarah, a freed slave of one of the Banu Abdul Muttalib, and Ikramah bin Abu Jahl, Sarah had insulted him in Mecca. What was this woman's death sentence for? She had insulted him in Mecca. So we see, and again, we could go into more detail, but we're about out of time. we see Muhammad ordering his followers to execute people, men and women, for making fun of him. The Quran, what's that? Go ahead.
And there are many other examples of that. Ka'b bin al-Ashraf, Asma bint Marwan, poets who made fun of Muhammad in their verses. He actually asked his followers for a volunteer who would kill them and rewarded the killers. And there are other examples as well.
And so the Quran orders Muslims to follow the example. Muhammad is the pattern of conduct for Muslims. That's Surah 33, verse 21. And chapter 4, verse 65 says that if you find any resistance in yourself against the teachings of Muhammad, against Muhammad's decisions, you're not even a real Muslim. It says you have no faith. So if you take
it repeatedly says to obey Muhammad, to obey Allah and his messenger. And 480 also, and many other passages, it insists on the necessity of obeying Muhammad. But Muhammad doesn't say anything in the Quran, if you accept that Allah is the author of it, or at least that's the idea in Islamic theology. So if Muhammad doesn't say anything in the Quran, then how are you going to obey Muhammad? You cannot possibly do that. You cannot fulfill this Quranic command. It's impossible. So you're either bound for hell or you have to go to the Hadith. So the Quran-only position is, as you have noted, completely incoherent.
And so the writers for the New York Times, if they sincerely believe what they're saying, that it's wrong and immoral to kill people or to subjugate people or to demonstrate intolerance or to kill blasphemers, then they are, if they really believe that, according to chapter 4, verse 65, they're not real Muslims. I'm not saying it, Allah is, right? He says you're not a real Muslim. You have no real faith unless you have no resistance against Muhammad's decisions. So all these westernized Muslims who keep telling us, oh, Muhammad would never do all the things we read that he did in the Muslim sources. Muhammad would never do those things. According to the Quran, they're not real Muslims unless they're trying to trick us. So that's the problem. The Islam that's being presented to us by publications like the New York Times is, according to the Quran and the Hadith, not real Islam. And that's why true Muslims don't go to the New York Times to learn about how to follow and obey Muhammad. All right, well, Robert, we're out of time here. Why don't you go ahead and take the final minute or so? Tell people what they can do. As far as we're being bombarded with this sort of thing. It's not just the New York Times. It's almost all of the media across the board. It's Hollywood. It's the education system. It's politicians. We're bombarded on all sides by misinformation. What can they do?
Well, in the first place, I would say we have to understand that these articles are for a purpose. They are designed to get us to accept various political positions of today. These articles are meant to make us think, oh, well, there's nothing wrong with mass Muslim migration into the West. And, oh, we shouldn't be worried about, we shouldn't want there to be law enforcement surveillance in Muslim communities or in mosques. We got nothing to worry about. These are tolerant, pluralistic, magnanimous people. Like Hillary Clinton said, Muslims are peaceful and tolerant people who have absolutely nothing to do with terrorism. And so that's what these things are all about. That's what they are designed to get us to believe. In response, we have to inform ourselves about the nature and magnitude of the threat and about the teachings of Muhammad and the Quran and the history of Islam. And this is a matter also of contemporary significance. It's not just about studying a religion or studying some history. It is in order to keep ourselves from being manipulated and forced into accepting things that are ultimately going to cause us grievous harm if we are forced to accept them indeed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So thank you, Robert, for joining us. Everyone, we know that there are plenty of peaceful Muslims out there. Why are they peaceful? Well, they're either pretending to be peaceful or they've reinterpreted Islam. And, on the one hand, I'm glad that they've reinterpreted Islam so that they're not hurting people. But here we're talking about what Islam actually teaches. So if the New York Times wants to say, hey, there are lots of peaceful people out there who believe in Allah and Muhammad, I would say, great, you can tell me that all day long. When you start pretending that that's what Muhammad ultimately wanted, and that's what the Quran ultimately calls for, absolute, total nonsense, and they should be ashamed of themselves. So thank you to Robert for joining in, sharing his decades of knowledge here. And as far as Super Chat, Chris K, Tom S, Yabon Banania, Rocky Desert Follower, thank you for jumping in there. And we'll see you next time. I mentioned that the next live stream will be with Anthony Rogers. I had to see if Robert could jump in here on this, because these were just coming out. I'll be live again with Anthony Rogers, 8:00 p.m. on Friday. We'll be talking about Allah's physical body parts, which, as we've seen, Muhammad Hijab does not know about. See you all then. God bless everyone.